Mary Vincent, a 15-year-old girl, was hitchhiking in California after running away from her parents' house due to constant fighting with them. Annoyed and frustrated, she decided to go to her grandparents' house, viewing hitchhiking as part of her journey. During her hitchhiking experience, she began looking for a ride. A middle-aged man driving a blue van stopped to help Mary. Upon arriving at the van, Mary found him initially wholesome and kind, which made her trust him. He told her he was heading in her direction, and that it wouldn't take too long to reach her destination. Mary got into his van, and they continued on their journey. At first, the man seemed friendly, making small talk and asking her about her journey. However, a few minutes into their trip, he took a wrong turn. Confused, Mary politely pointed out that this was the wrong exit. The man responded by saying he had forgotten and would get back en route at the next exit. After a while, however, he pulled over in a quiet, abandoned place. Confused, Mary asked him what was happening. Sensing danger, she attempted to leave, but before she could turn away, the driver grabbed her hands and struck her repeatedly. When she was slightly unconscious, he took ownership of her multiple times while continuing to strike her. Mary pleaded with the driver to let her go, but he was not finished with his brutality. He then grabbed an axe to amputate her forearms. She screamed in pain, but the driver felt no remorse. Shocked and frozen, she was unable to react when he mutilated her left arm before throwing her off a 30-foot cliff, leaving her perished. Believing Mary was deceased, the driver went on with his journey. After being thrown off the cliff, Mary lost consciousness due to a head injury. When she finally regained consciousness, she found herself at the bottom of the cliff, without clothes or anything to aid her. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, she packed mud into her wounds. With immense determination, she climbed the steep hill, using only her legs. Once she reached the road, she began looking for help, but saw no one around. She walked another 3 miles in search of assistance, hiding whenever she thought her attacker might return. Eventually, a couple spotted her in her horrific state and transported her to the nearest hospital, saving her life. The driver was later identified as Lawrence Singleton, a 51-year-old ex-merchant seaman at the time of the incident. He had a history of alcoholism and was known for being aggressive. Although Singleton had a troubling history of alcohol, many believed he was not capable of such crime. His incident on Mary was shocking, cruel, and reminiscent of a serial killer's actions. During his trial, he showed no remorse and even claimed that Mary was lying, despite strong evidence against him. He received only 14 years in prison, but was released after 8 years for good behavior. This leniency caused public outrage. Many believed that if he could commit such crimes without remorse, he would, undoubtedly, do it again. After his release, Singleton done it again, killing an innocent woman to ensure her death. He was subsequently placed on death row, but died of cancer in 2001. Luckily, Mary survived the incident, but has to live with lifetime of trauma. Carol DeRanche, an 18-year-old adult, drove herself to a mall, though she normally went with her sister. But on this special occasion, she had just gotten a car, and this was her first experience driving alone. After shopping in the mall, a man approached her introduced himself as Officer Roseland and told her that someone was breaking into her car in the mall parking lot. The officer wasn't wearing a uniform, but read Durant's license number, which she believed, and she ended up following him. In the mall's parking lot, Durant examined her vehicle and saw nothing had been stolen. The officer then asked if she would accompany him to the police station, because authorities were holding the man who had tried to break into her car. At this point, Durant said there was something suspicious about him, and she didn't want to go. The officer then pulled out a wallet, giving her proof of his identity. Durant believed the officer, and they both went to his car. Durant thought it was going to be a police car, but it ended up being a Volkswagen Beetle. She thought he was off-duty or undercover, so she didn't think much of the situation. In the officer's Volkswagen Beetle, the officer drove Durant through town for a while before telling her to put her seatbelt on, but she refused. He then suddenly turned into a curb near an elementary school. Having grown up in Murray, Durant knew they were nowhere near the police station and started screaming, saying, "Who are you? What do you want?" The officer was totally still and didn't say a word. Then after a while, he grabbed her hand and put her in handcuffs. She fought him off and prevented him from fully restraining her by fighting back. He then pulled out a gun and threatened to shoot her in the head. In this situation, she knew she had to fight back, or she would end up going with this random guy. She fought back and eventually escaped from the car. The perpetrator came after her with a crowbar, but down the street, a family was driving and saw the situation. They popped open a door, and Durant jumped inside the car, leaving the officer with a crowbar alone. After extensive investigation, the perpetrator was identified as the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy, who had primarily murdered 11 people before this attempted abduction. He was later found, and Durant was able to prove that he was the attacker. Ted Bundy was later executed, and Carol remains frozen in terror, haunted by the thought of what could have happened to her, imagining the horror she narrowly escaped. Carlisha Freeland Geither was a 22-year-old woman from Philadelphia. One night, after spending time with friends, she was walking home to her parked car. She chose a well-lit area near her friend's house, thinking it was safe. However, a suspicious man was parked near her car waiting for Carlisha after spotting her. He then exits the vehicle and crosses the road to get a good glimpse of her. After walking down the road, he spots Carlisha vulnerable. And approaches her, giving her a handshake before dragging her in the direction of the car. You can see Carlisha shocked and screaming, but the man was gripping her tight so she couldn't escape. She tried to fight back, but the intruder drags her in the car and drives off. After the abduction, the police released the CCTV footage to the public, hoping someone would recognize the man and help find Carlisha. For nearly 24 hours, she was held captive in his car where he drove around, changing locations to avoid being seen. At one point, the kidnapper stopped at a gas station, but forgot to lock the doors. This mistake allowed Carlisha to escape. She ran into the gas station and immediately asked the staff for help. They quickly contacted the police. When law enforcement arrived, Carlisha shared details about her abductor. Thanks to her quick thinking, the police were able to locate and arrest Delvin Barnes, a middle-aged man with a history of kidnapping. He was later sentenced to 35 years in prison for his crime. Despite surviving this traumatic experience, Carlisha still feels the effects of what happened to her and takes extra precautions to ensure her safety. Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old, was sleeping in a room she shared with her younger sister. They were both asleep when an intruder entered through an open window in their room. The man began walking around the room until he caught Elizabeth's attention. He took her away while she was awake, holding her at knife point so she couldn't scream or say a word. Her sister, pretending to be asleep to avoid being caught by the intruder, was too shocked to move. For 2 hours, she stayed frozen before finally telling her parents. By then, Elizabeth was long gone, leaving no signs behind. Her parents immediately called the police and reported the crime, and it became a globally known case. When Elizabeth was taken, the perpetrator, named Brian Mitchell, told her he was a prophet and that he had been chosen to take her. He had specifically targeted Elizabeth after working for her family the year before. Terrified and scared, Elizabeth did as she was told. On bare feet, he led her to nearby mountains where his wife, Wanda Barzee, was waiting. There, Mitchell conducted a marriage ceremony, declaring Elizabeth as his wife. Over the course of her captivity, Elizabeth experienced many signs of bodily harm, enduring pain and suffering the entire time she was kidnapped. The case became one of the most widely known in U.S. history, with many people volunteering to help find the perpetrator. Elizabeth's sister, the only witness, initially didn't know who the intruder was, but later, she remembered his voice from when he worked for her family. A detailed sketch of Mitchell was made and distributed to the public. But despite the growing attention, Elizabeth remained hidden, usually veiled and fully covered, making it difficult for anyone to recognize her. Mitchell constantly threatened to unalive her family if she tried to escape or reveal her identity, and this fear kept her silent in public. In one instance, after the sketch was released, a librarian recognized Mitchell and saw him with a girl who seemed suspiciously familiar. However, Mitchell managed to get away by disguising Elizabeth as his daughter. It wasn't until 9 months later that Mitchell was finally recognized by the public through the sketch. He was spotted walking down the street with both perpetrators, Elizabeth heavily disguised with a wig and sunglasses, making her hard to identify. When police approached them, Wanda Barzee tried to convince the officers that they had the wrong person, claiming Elizabeth was her daughter. However, after separating Elizabeth from her captors and speaking to her privately, she revealed the truth, that she'd been kidnapped. Both Mitchell and Barzee were arrested. Barzee was sentenced to 15 years, but was released in 2018 for good behavior, while Mitchell was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elizabeth was reunited with her family and was deeply emotional as she explained her ordeal to the police. As she grew older, she told her story in a book she wrote, and has since helped many others who have been in similar situations.